Are gearing up for a legal battle against the Pentagon. A new policy is demanding that reporters with a Pentagon credential sign a pledge not to obtain or use unauthorized material in their reporting. But when asked about the policy, President Trump seemed to be on a different page.
Should the Pentagon be in charge of deciding what reporters can report on?
No, I don't think so.
Are you
nothing,
okay? Are you
nothing,
okay with them limiting
listen,
that?
nothing stops reporters, you know.
Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's office has already banned some news outlets, including CNN, from media workspaces and made some areas of the Pentagon restricted to journalists without an official escort. CNN chief media analyst Brian Stelter is with us now. Brian, tell us about this new policy and how extraordinary this is.
Well, the Wall Street Journal is calling it deeply disturbing. Other publications are vowing to push back on this, and there could be a legal battle in the days ahead. But first, newsroom leaders and media lawyers are evaluating this new memo from the Pentagon and trying to figure out the smartest pathway forward. It does seem that Hegseth and his press office want journalists to be reduced simply to parrots, simply repeating Pentagon talking points that are approved by the U.S. military to make Hegseth and his team look good. But of course, journalists work for the public. We're trying to serve the public interest to find out what the military is doing in the name of all Americans. So this policy leverages the fact that many reporters who cover the military have press credentials that allow them access to the Pentagon complex. According to this memo, the Pentagon beat reporters are being told they have to sign a pledge that they will not obtain or use unauthorized material, even though some of the most important, most vital stories about the U.S. military do start with leaks of unauthorized material.
Hello, Bobby Jones here for MeidasTouch and Valor Media Networks. And today I want to talk to you about a story that has a cross-section of American military, the American press, and transparency. September 19th, the Pentagon under Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth issued a new policy that he is requiring journalists to sign. Basically, it says that journalists will not disclose sensitive or unauthorized information, which includes unclassified material. Now, the reason he's doing this is because he feels as the current press corps at the Pentagon has leaked a lot of information. And he's probably right. The problem with that is it's the contacts and the sources that those journalists have who are willing to leak certain information because they believe what is happening is fundamentally wrong. The reason that this situation is causing many Americans and those subject matter experts to be concerned is because the military has often had the United States press corps embedded with them basically all the way back to the American Civil War. Heck, it was actually part of the strategy used to turn hearts and minds and to actually win the information war. So let's go back a little bit and just run through how the First Amendment, which protects freedom of the press, has been used when covering the United States military and why the actions that Hegseth has just enacted are definitely without precedent. During the American Civil War, the first time Americans were able to see the horrors of war brought to their doorstep, thanks to the new technology known as photography, many journalists became famous throughout the country. Why? Because they followed units around and covered what they saw. Now, because of the gruesomeness and the savagery of the American Civil War, it definitely helped shape public opinion. By the time World War I came around and the United States entered it, having embedded reporters just seemed like something that naturally happened when you deployed troops. And unfortunately, it was able to convey the absolute gruesomeness of this new form of mechanized warfare. As a matter of fact, this is really the first time you saw reporters being killed while covering the action that they were looking at. Also, because the advent of airplane, air travel, observation balloons, they were able to see war from various angles that we have not seen before. Very powerful tool, both tactically and to report back to the United States what was happening with all the thousands of soldiers that were deployed. As World War II came into the forefront, now you had a generation of leaders who understood the power of the press. Franklin D. Roosevelt used the press very, very, very well when conveying to Americans what the goal of the war was, but most importantly, during his fireside chats, would help convey where American troops had moved and what they had done. Now, because of the access that the press got, they also agreed to adhere to strict operational security requirements. For example, the reports of Pearl Harbor happening, the numbers of casualties were limited by the press because Roosevelt did not want national morale to plummet due to the sheer savagery of the attack. This continued on both in Europe and in the Pacific theater. As a matter of fact, towards the second half of the war, you saw the press putting out things to try to deliberately mislead enemies on both sides because they realized there were spy networks that were absorbing every piece of information. But again, the press was given access and the media understood how they played a role in operational security. For the most part, and let me just say for the most part, the press got along very well with the troops they covered because they were considered basically part of the unit. They were embarked for so long. So journalists like Ernie Pyle, etc., became household names in the American media due to their willingness and bravery to cover some of the most fierce fighting. But at the same time, the government could trust them to understand that they were part of a larger war effort. However, by the time we get to Vietnam, things changed. Vietnam was such a slow creep up to high-level operations that really those guidelines that the press had used in World War II and even Korea kind of went by the wayside. Media, for the first time, really got unrestricted access to various things in country. And boy, did it provide huge backlash at home. Once the reports from the front started hitting America, Americans everywhere asked, what are we doing and why are we there? The viciousness of the attacks and jungle warfare made Americans question the fight to stop communism versus the sacrificing of America's young men, mostly. It got to the point where protests literally took over the country solely off of news reports. And this was not just a newspaper. You had color footage beamed in everybody's home of what was happening. Journalists like Dan Rather became famous because they were willing to go into the bush, cover the gruesomeness, and basically tell a story that was accurate, which was counter to what the federal government was saying. President Johnson began to detest the press because it made Americans' military seem like they were incompetent. Well, in reality, America's military was in fact not winning the war, and the journalists were not hesitant in telling that. That all came to a climax with the Pentagon Papers, basically classified documents that were leaked and published. And the ramifications of that are still felt to this day when it comes to operational security. The media actually had the power to help stop a war. Vietnam became a stalemate. The cries for people to end the war were just amplified by the media and those who were coming back home after serving their draft time. And lo and behold, Saigon eventually fell. Because of the hard lessons learned during Vietnam, by the time Desert Storm rolled around, media were now back as embedded journalists within units, which gave the military much more control over what they said and the ability to censor anything that was said. You have to understand, many of the generals and admirals that fought Desert Storm were junior officers during Vietnam. So the memory was fresh in their minds on how powerful the media could be. Now, Desert Storm was such a brilliant military operation, pretty quick, relatively clean for warfare, that a lot of the issues did not come up. However, what was brilliant about Desert Storm, for the first time, the whole world saw a war kick off. CNN famously broadcasted with a feed on the phone and one camera catching all of the aerial bombardment that took place during the initial hours of Desert Storm. It changed how we as the public could view warfare. And most importantly, the press could then ask direct questions based on what they were seeing in real time, an absolute game changer. Now how we consume war is completely different than, say, what was happening during the American Civil War in 1860. because of how that war played out, today's military and today's media have a completely almost symbiotic relationship when it comes to military conflict. First of all, the issue of transparency versus oversight is important. Many of the investigations that have happened with the military, specifically in Iraq and Afghanistan, came because of reports that the media put out there. By using their First Amendment rights, it actually was used to check military operations and individual military misconduct. This is one of the reasons why I think Hegseth does not want the military press, that's embedded with the military, to say and report on just anything. Because the reality of it is, you may or may not like what the press puts out there. However, the legal and constitutional issue of the freedom of the press and their right to report it without the government infringing upon that right is pretty significant. It's very significant. Also, the operational impact of what the media reports is significant because depending on how the public perceives things, it can literally change the strategy of war. This is something that we're seeing with Israel, Hamas, and Gaza right now. October 7th, the world was with Israel. Now, not so much. And it's because of the reporting that has come out of Gaza. And mind you, Israel has made a point to restrict reporter access because of the power of this information warfare side that the media is put out. Now, let's get back to Hegseth. Hegseth has had a very tough time with the media. There's no way to describe it. Everything that he's done has been questioned. Everything that has leaked from the Pentagon has been broadcast, to include Signalgate, where he was putting out information over an unclassified app on his phone. The media has been pretty relentless with him, and at times Hegseth seems to be overmatched and overwhelmed. Now, when you add that there are people within the Pentagon and operational forces who have leaked things to the media because they don't agree with what's happening or they feel like it may be borderline illegal, this is why he's trying to lock down the Pentagon's information machine. He believes that he can control the narrative. He will be able to progress in a way that he and President Trump wants. The problem with that is there are still legal rights of the media. And most importantly, historically, it is the media that has kept the military on the straight and narrow path when operating. If you're not doing anything wrong, then you should not fear someone telling the truth. And in this case, especially with unclassified information, I do believe the Secretary of Defense may be overstepping his bounds because he's trying to protect things that he knows the American public can see as questionable.
Love this video? Support independent media and unlock exclusive content, ad-free videos, and custom emojis by becoming a paid member of our YouTube channel today. You can also gift memberships to others. Let's keep growing together.